Despite the harsh conditions, the long march continued. Ultimately, the Red Army reported more deaths in the grasslands than in the snowy mountains. Forces loyal to the nationalists were still in pursuit, but they fared even worse than the communists in the Great Grasslands and were eventually forced to turn back with only a fraction of their numbers intact. After Mao's and Zhang Guotao's combined Red Armies successfully crossed the Great Grasslands, the two leaders renewed their dispute about the goal of the Long March. While Mao felt that the Red Army needed the relative safety and distance from Chiang Kai-shek, Zhang still felt he was strong enough to return south and re-establish the communist presence. Some on both sides wanted to keep the armies from splitting up by force. As tensions ran high, so did the risk of a new civil war, this one within the Red Army. So, perhaps wisely, the two armies decided to separate. With some 80,000 men, Zhang returned to the south, taking the lion's share of the Red's supplies. Mao led about 10,000 die-hard supporters to the north, toward Shanxi province. Ironically, the split may have helped Mao's forces to gain some breathing room from the pursuing nationalists. The loss of the Fourth Red Army left Mao's forces seriously weakened. With hundreds of miles of rugged territory to cross and numerous battles yet to fight, they were more vulnerable than ever. In September 1935, the Red Army reached the border with Gansu province, just south of their objective, Shanxi province. Here they faced one last natural obstacle to their advance, the Lazico Pass. The pass at Lazico was extremely narrow, in some spots just 12 feet wide. The right side consisted of a cliff that rose almost vertically for 1,000 feet. Just across the gorge rose another cliff, this one not quite as high as the other. The pass was defended from above by nationalist blockhouses. In all, 3 regiments and 2 battalions held the important corridor. On September 15th, Mao issued the following order: "We must take the Lazico Pass or go back through the grasslands." Mao issued the following order: "We must take the Lazico Pass or go back through the grasslands." Given the suffering the Reds endured in the swamps, this was the last place any of them wanted to go. But a succession of night attacks failed with heavy casualties. Mao ordered a halt to direct assaults and turned to a band of experienced mountaineers to develop a new plan. From prisoners, they learned that additional nationalist forces would soon arrive. With time running out, they set out into the darkness and began to scale one side of the sheer canyon wall. After an agonizing climb, the Red assault team reached the top and began raining grenades down on the nationalists. Still, the defenders refused to withdraw. Finally, according to the communists, one volunteer in the Red assault team lit all of his explosives, then threw himself into the nationalist position. The nationalist soldiers who survived the blast ran for their lives. The Red Army would not have to return to the grasslands. October 20, 1935. After 368 days of relentless marching and fighting, Mao Zedong's First Red Army finally reached Shanxi province. The long march appeared to be over. In Shanxi, the vanguard of the First Red Army linked up with other Red forces that had earlier established a small base of communist power in this desolate area. Here, the rugged landscape helped to protect the Reds. Of the original 87,000 men and women who began the Long March, fewer than 6,000 made it to Shanxi. Together with the 30,000 Red troops already in Shanxi, the survivors of Mao's army began to recruit a new army, one that would begin a gradual, relentless drive to control all of China. Although the Long March was technically a defeat, the Communists ultimately won a political victory. During the journey, they passed through provinces populated by millions of people, winning thousands of converts along the way. The Long March transformed Mao Zedong from a regional figure into a budding national leader. He now had a following among common people from all over China. Yet, to win a civil war in China, Mao would need hundreds of thousands of new soldiers. But the question was, where would he get them? Several months after the First Red Army arrived in Shanxi, Zhang Guotao's Fourth Red Army straggled into camp. His army was decimated during battles with the Nationalists. 2 out of every 3 of his men were killed. Ironically, it was the Japanese occupation that helped the Reds. Communist propaganda teams exploited the issue, proclaiming that the Red Army was the only Chinese military force that would stand up to the invaders. This message struck a nerve with the local people in Shanxi. By 1937, Chiang Kai-shek was preparing for another major campaign against Mao's army. But by now, some in his military alliance had seen enough. The Red Army and the Nationalists finally agreed to an anti-Japanese alliance in 1937. But the truce was uneasy. When their joint campaign against Japan ended in 1945, the simmering conflict exploded into civil war. By now, the Red Army had over 1 million soldiers. It held 19 base areas and controlled a population of 100 million people across the North China Plain. But the Western powers threw their support and massive amounts of military assistance to Chiang Kai-shek. For many communists, the Long March was still not over. 1945. Following almost 8 years of an uneasy alliance to fight the invading Japanese, the Reds and Nationalists battled in a renewed civil war. Now more was at stake than just the future of China. This was the first showdown of the Cold War. For some nationalists, the defeat came as a shock. Others could see it coming. In 1949, the Nationalists and Chiang Kai-shek were driven off the mainland and took refuge on the island of Taiwan. Chiang never returned to China. On October 1st, Mao Zedong declared the foundation of the People's Republic of China in Tiananmen Square. The ultimate outcome of the Long March was finally decided. China was no longer a collection of semi-independent provinces ruled by feudal warlords, but a nation that was finally unified under the flag of the Communist Red Army. Most communists believed the seeds for victory in 1949 were planted along the rugged trail of the Long March.
正像毛泽东说的那样啊，长征是宣言书，他向全世界宣告，红军是英雄好汉，这一点丝毫也不夸张。可以说，古今中外历史上啊，很难有与之相比拟的。红军凭着坚定的革命信念，战胜了一切艰难险阻，最后赢得了红军长征的胜利。
The Nationalists could not dispute the fact that Mao Zedong's core group of 6,000 die-hard survivors went on to take over a country of 500 million people. The veterans of the Long March earned a standing that virtually ensured their place within the Communist Party. Most all of the high-ranking government and military officials during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s were survivors of the march.
and that held that party leadership together really until almost 1995, 96. Some of those original Long Marchers who were the leaders of the country began to die.
Those few veterans who are still alive have attained a special, almost celebrity status and are treated with extraordinary respect. Standing head and shoulders above all the survivors is Mao Zedong. Despite decades of starvation and suffering by the Chinese people under some of his policies, he is still referred to by some as the great helmsman of the revolution. Mao, Zhou Enlai, Zhu Da, and the others who led the Long March are now considered to be the founding fathers of modern China. By most standards, their Long March Odyssey was a remarkable feat. It's an epic tale now taught in military academies the world over. Although some historians dismiss details of the communist story as propaganda, many agree it was an astonishing military maneuver. In 1 year and a day, the First Red Army covered nearly 6,000 miles, the distance from New York to San Francisco and back again. They averaged nearly 24 miles per day. They climbed 18 major mountain ranges and crossed over 24 rivers. The Reds occupied 62 cities and towns and broke through 10 enveloping armies commanded by local warlords. But the First Red Army was not the only group to undertake a long march. In an achievement that makes the tale all the more remarkable, 2 other major Red Armies eventually made their way north. They overcame many of the same mountains, swamplands, and hostile warlords along the way.
For me, the Long March must rate with some of the most epic military expeditions throughout history. Nobody has ever retreated anything like that distance, suffered such immense casualties and yet managed to keep the basic organisation together. It's a quite remarkable achievement for which there's no real parallel throughout human history.
The ability to take, starting out with over 100,000 people, and over the course of a year, mostly on foot, without supplies, without being able to count on support as you went, move that far in that period of time across that kind of terrain, I think is one of the heroic military achievements in history.
The story reached the West after a sympathetic American writer, Edgar Snow, recorded Mao Zedong's account verbatim in 1936. Snow's book was welcomed in China, and afterward the march took on mythological proportions. Today, the tale is a virtual cornerstone of China's national identity.
It's an important mythology because the Long March represents perseverance under hardship, bravery, and the ability to continue towards a goal despite the suffering. And it represents politically tremendous cooperation among the leadership of the Communist Party.
毛主席你曾经说这么句话：长征啊，将来啊，长征胜利啊，还会发芽、长叶、开花、结果。他还预言说，将来啊会取得收获的，这个收获是相当大的。
Just as tourists visit the famous battlefields of Europe, people from all over China visit the famous landmarks of the Long March. At every significant location of the journey, monuments dot the Chinese landscape. They stand in mute testimony to an extraordinary event, a quest for survival that ultimately charted a new path for China.
长征是伟大，毛主席他们领导的好，所以才有今天。现在我们国家组织得很好，发展得快。 那都是原来的更好啊！来贯彻长征的精神，死了那么多的人，现在我们是享福啊，享谁的？享他们的福，所以我说不要忘他这些了。
是啊，牺牲的真的是很自然的，没办法，我们在永远都牺牲了，我们在合作，啊，继续完成他没有完成的义务。这一代的不仅是我们这一代，我们也希望呢，是我们中国人民，中国的是啊青年一代，要继续，要有继承这个方面。